Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to the IGAC Early Career Seminar. This is our monthly seminar for any early career members of the IGAC community to share their research. And every other month we also have tutorials or workshops. And then we also have plenty of open room for the rest of the year if anyone else wants to present. So if you're interested in presenting, feel free to email us. The email is igacecr@igacproject.org. And I'll put that in the chat. But for today, our speaker is Camille Fournier de Lauriere. Camille is a PhD student at ETH in Zurich, where he studies the environmental politics of air quality. And so today's topic is, will more air quality monitoring help clean up the air? So yeah, feel free to get started.
Super. Yeah, thank you, Emmy, for the introduction. Yeah, as a bit of more background, maybe. I studied ecology and I used remote sensing to study vegetation and biodiversity. And 2 years ago, I started my PhD project in an environmental politics group, looking at this link between information and how this can help essentially solve environmental issues with this example of air pollution. And here is kind of, in this presentation, I want to talk about different papers from different research that we've been doing in the group. And this is the first time I kind of putting all of these together. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion, also presenting to a crowd that is maybe a bit different from what I've been discussing this with. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty science details, I would like to ask you 3 questions that you can start thinking about. And the first one is whether you know if there is an air pollution monitor in a city where you live. The second one is, if there is, how often do you look up that information before you go outside? And finally, the third question is, if there is information in your city, do you think this is contributing to reducing air pollution levels? And whether you think yes or no, maybe try to think about the reasons why it may or it may not lead to improvements in the air quality. I'll let you just think a bit about these questions. Okay, now why care about air pollution at all in the first place? I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but air pollution leads to about 7 million premature deaths every year, and is the first global environmental health risk that humans are facing right now. And all these deaths are not evenly distributed around the globe, but 9 out of 10 of these deaths are in lower and middle income countries where exposure is the highest, because pollution levels are high, and this is where most people live. Okay, now what do we do when we have a polluted city? What is being proposed very often in this monitoring literature is that by producing data and allowing the people to know how polluted their city is, they will ask from the government to do something about it, and this will clean the air. At least many papers, here is just a subset of some of them, but many papers argue about this link between having information about air pollution and this leading to improvements in air pollution levels. And here we have examples from China or from Latin America, but also this cross-city comparison in all cities of Global South or capital cities of lower and middle income countries. But what we don't really know is what actually happens in there. Like when you set up a monitor, we think about ways that this could lead to improvements, but what actually happens is not so well documented right now. And so what I want to propose here is this like small theory of change model where we think, okay, how do we get from a monitor being placed to the air quality to improve? And I'll just walk you through the steps now, and they are kind of going to guide us throughout the presentation. The first thing is that we say, okay, a monitor is going to be placed, and this is going to raise awareness for people that live in the neighborhood or that live in the area, and citizens might ask for politicians or for their governments to do something about it. And this may translate into some policy design from the authorities, and this might lead to this policy being enforced. And ultimately, this would lead to a cleaner air over time. Okay. Now, this all sounds like this could happen mechanically, but obviously that's not the case. There are many different barriers that stop, let's say, that means that when you have a monitor being placed, it doesn't mean that citizens are going to ask for action or that the government is going to respond to it. And so I kind of want to visualize this with these barriers. And we'll discuss further what these barriers are. And what I would like to focus on today is how do we bypass these barriers? So how do we go from no monitor into having actual cleaner air? Okay, now if we get back to this first question I asked earlier about whether there is a monitoring device that measures air pollution where you live. Well, in a study that we published earlier this year, we looked at what is the globally available information on air pollution. So we focus here on lower and middle income countries. And we use three databases for those that may know them: OpenAQ, WACI, the World Air Quality Index, and Purple Air. So here in this representation, I don't really disentangle between the different types of monitoring. But if you look at this map, you can see that essentially some places like India and China have a pretty substantial amount of monitors. If you look at Eastern Europe, that is also the case. But for most of the rest of lower and middle income countries, it's very sparse. The number of monitors that you see on the map is very low. And we found that 90% of cities in lower and middle income countries do not have publicly available air quality monitoring. And so when doing these cross-country comparisons, we also ran some modelization or some models to understand, okay, but what makes a city in lower and middle income country more likely to see a monitor? And we found that it's not only that richer or more populated or more polluted cities would be more likely to have a monitor, but that there is some political differences in who gets a monitor. Let me explain this with this predicted probability plot here. So here you have on the y-axis the predicted probability of seeing an air quality monitor, and here are the pollution levels. And basically we made two lines for these predictions here: cities that are in more democratic settings and cities that are in less democratic settings. And what you can see is that essentially, if you're in a democratic setting, the more polluted you are, the more likely you are the more polluted you are, the more likely you are to see a monitor, to host a monitor. And you kind of see the reverse pattern in autocracies. And this clearly shows that this is not just a determined development. So not all cities, when they develop and when they get richer, get a monitor. It does depend on the political will of the local authorities. And this kind of highlights this first barrier where the placement of monitor is already determined by political factors. Okay. So now that we discussed where monitors are, I would like to focus more on, okay, we need more monitoring, but what do we actually want it for? And this goes back to the second question I asked you. How often do you look up that information before going outside? And instead of doing a cross-city comparison, what we did to try to answer this question is to do some field work in South Africa, in Johannesburg. So here you have a map of Johannesburg that shows the different income decile. What we did is we went primarily into lower and middle income neighborhoods because these are where people are most exposed to air pollution. And here you can see, so the respondents are marked with these black points here. So we have them across the city, and we can also see that there is air quality monitors. These red triangles are monitoring sites that you can find here from the OpenAQ website, but they are also available if you Google South Africa, Johannesburg, air pollution. So these are government-owned monitors. And what you can see is that there is quite a substantial amount of monitors in Johannesburg. And so we asked people in this setting, if they wanted to know how much air pollution there is, would they be able to find this information? And secondly, how often or not do they look up this information? Oh, and this is published in Environmental Research Letters last year, end of last year. And so here are the results. Here's what our respondents answered. So for the first question, whether people would be able to find the information if they wanted to, we found that overall, most people would not know where to find this, and that only 20% of the overall population in our respondents would certainly know where to find it. If I split this by age group, we found that younger people are more likely to know, and older people in opposition are likely to not know. So you can see that younger people, that younger people tend to at least to say that they are more able to find this information, probably because they know how to use their phone better, they know how to use technology, etc. But now, if we ask people whether or not they look up this information, even people that may know rarely do. In the overall sample, you can see here that only 13% of our respondents would look at the information often. Most of them would never do it, and a large portion of them would rarely do it. And again, there is this pattern with age where younger respondents are more likely to do it, even so rarely. But maybe striking here is that even though younger people are more likely to know where to find the information, they don't really look at it more often. And this is highlighting this like kind of second barrier. So even when you have monitors, it won't always translate into citizens knowing about it, both knowing about it, but also knowing what to do about it. So this, again, the second step of citizens calling for action is not mechanistic and is driven by more things than just putting down a monitor. Okay, now we jump onto this third question or this third section of the presentation, which is linking a monitor being placed in a city with improvements in air quality. Maybe you have already some ideas about why it would work or why it would not work. But let's look at some descriptive empirics first. Here is another paper that I'm currently working on, which is using remote sensing data for measuring PM 2.5. And this is from the Van Donkelaar team, if some of you are using this data or know about the group. Essentially, here I used trends for all cities around the world, going from 98 to 2019, pre-COVID, and looked at the trajectory over time. And so I did this for all cities around the world, and the color of the country here is essentially the mode, so the most common trajectory for the cities within that country. And you can see the colors go from a purple scale to a more green scale. Purple scale meaning more, let's say, pessimistic trajectories where air pollution is rising, what we observe in Egypt, Malaysia. In India is this like lighter purple where trajectory started to plateau. And then the more greenish trajectories are more optimistic trends in the US, for example, where air pollution is declining kind of steadily, and in Italy where it was plateauing, and then we see some decrease. The yellow category is, I think China is the best example of this one, where you see like a stark increase and then a pretty strong turning point with a decrease in these last 20 years. Okay, and so the first thing you can see from this map is, at least to me, is this stark differentiation between the green trends and the rest of the world. And you can see that in most sections of the global north, you see overall declines of air pollution. And you see a lot of heterogeneity in cities of lower and middle income countries or in the global south here. And now if we think about how to link this with the monitoring activity, well, the first thing we find is that places that did have a lot of monitor, so India and China are good examples, do not necessarily see the same signs of improvement. So as you can see, China does have a very stark decrease, but India doesn't really show that, even though both countries have a lot of monitoring. Another realization with this paper is that monitoring is maybe not needed to see improvements. So in many places in lower and middle income countries, notably in South America, you do see these declines, right? Like many countries are essentially yellow. But these places did not have a lot of air quality monitoring. So it seems that improvements can occur even without this data being available. Okay, and we kind of discussed this further into a paper that is already published. There is no nice visualization for this paper because it's more of a discussion about the link between monitoring and air pollution mitigation. And in this paper, we kind of complement this empirical section that I just mentioned by saying that yes, monitoring can help improve air pollution, but the barriers towards actual action is more of a political issue. So what drives improvements is essentially government action, and this is not always driven by monitoring, but it's driven by many other things. And that you have policies that may have the potential to reduce air pollution even when there is no um, extensive monitoring infrastructure set up. And so we argue that these policies could be put in place even without waiting for monitoring to be set up in places where you don't have data, but you may have very high levels of pollution and where the sources may also be obvious. Okay, kind of want to represent this with here the lack of a monitor doesn't mean that action is impossible and improvements from these actions. Okay, now I will try to discuss a bit the evidence I just presented, and kind of I wanted to mention this example of a report from the Pakistan Air Quality Initiative, and they had a whole campaign where they set up many hundreds of monitors in all across Pakistan, and this led to, and they also gathered many different scientists from experts from air pollution in Pakistan to write this very large report. And this report actually was picked up by the environmental agency in Pakistan, and it seems to be, so it's very recent. I think it was published end of last year, and this seems to have brought attention to for both the public and for politicians. So I just thought it was worth mentioning. It's still that this doesn't mean obviously that this report is going to lead to reductions in air pollution, but it is at least, let's say, bridging the gap to having citizens ask for more action and for action to be designed by the government as it's being picked up. Okay, now some caveats about the kind of this presentation I just gave. I've used this simplified model of theory of change to kind of illustrate the purpose, but I don't think monitoring has an effect only in these like very determined steps. I do think monitoring can contribute into various stages of the air pollution abatement process. For example, a monitor could help directly better design policies, or the fact that we have specific measurements of how much a certain industry is polluting can help enforce some regulations that would be put in place. Or maybe that just the fact that you have an information allows to look at the long trend, like a long trend, as what I'm doing with the remote sensing now, and see where are we seeing progress and where are we seeing stagnation, or where is the air pollution worsening even. And so this can be already used directly by citizens to, again, ask for action. So I guess these two are limited. Just want to say that this is not like a top-down kind of determined mechanistic scheme, but that this is kind of a more going back and forth kind of process. I also wanted to mention that monitoring, like I've been focusing on mitigation a lot because it's easier to monitor air pollution levels with remote sensing than to measure what people are doing on the ground. But information can also be used by people to adapt their behavior. Of course, not everybody has the same capacity to adapt to adapt their behavior, but still worth mentioning here. And kind of finally on this like discussion side, I just wanted to say that most of the work I've been talking about here has been done by our team here of researchers in ETH Zurich, and we have partners, notably in Jakarta and in South Africa. But most of what I'm saying right now is kind of discussed with this lens of being a European that doesn't live in a very polluted place where our pollution has been declining. So I just wanted to point that out as a positionality statement. Okay, and now for the things that I would love you to remember from my presentation. As we've seen, in most places, there is no publicly available measurements of air pollution levels. So in 90% of cities, we don't have any on-the-ground measurement of of air pollution levels. And this is kind of highlighting this first barrier here. The second takeaway is that just having a monitor set up doesn't always translate into cleaner air. You have all these different barriers. We had evidence in this second paper on how people might have the information available to them, but might not know where to find it, or even not even use it, even when they know that it exists. And I didn't elaborate more on the other barriers, but obviously there are other barriers that might, even though the monitoring would translate into citizens asking for action, the government doesn't always have to act upon it. Or maybe there's this example in Indonesia where many regulations exist, but they are not already enforced. And so again, like another gap that has to be solved, I would argue, not with a technological fix, but more with a political action. And again, to hammer this last point, air pollution in the end does not feel as much as a data-driven issue, like a technical problem where we need better measurements. Of course, we do also need this. We also need better measurements. We also need better coverage to understand the issue. But ultimately, we can think about how to use these information to convince both citizens and politicians that they should be doing something about air pollution. Just monitoring is not enough. You have to work with the local political context. Okay, and so with this, I would say that more focus could be put into this research, into understanding how do we overcome all these different barriers, and more specifically, maybe how can we use AQM to overcome these different barriers? Meaning, for example, how do we communicate about these measurements? Do we communicate differently to citizens or to politicians? What kind of information do experts need on the ground? Is it more for resource allocation or the composition of the pollution composition? So yeah, I think that's kind of the main point that I wanted to communicate, and kind of this is a recent thought that I have been having, which is that it is quite popular now as a thing to basically say that okay, high income countries should help set up monitors in lower middle income countries, and usually this is done through funding. But what can happen is essentially you have these examples with the U.S. embassies, the U.S. Embassy. Now, actually, the program is kind of shut down. I actually don't know what happened recently, but the program was announced to be shut down. And you have essentially a high-income countries just providing data, information, but this is just not enough to overcome these barriers, is what I need. So maybe we need to rethink the way we provide this information and engage more with the local context and build capacity for people on the ground to build their own networks, like what is being done with ERCO in Uganda. Okay, I wanted to leave it at this. I think this slide for me is the most important thing I would like you guys to remember. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. As I said, it's the first time for me to present this in this package. So yeah, really looking forward to know what you think.
Thank you, Camille. That was super interesting. Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute and maybe raise your hand. I can start us off with a question. I'm just curious if you saw differences with like depending on who owns the monitors, like whether it's government owned or owned by a community group, and if that like made a noticeable difference in the impact.
Yeah, so for me, this refers more to this paper, let's say, or I can also talk about it for the first paper where we look at where is monitor placed. So first of all, we found that where monitors are placed, we kind of see it doesn't really matter if we're talking about like government-owned monitors or if we talk about citizen-owned monitors. We see the same pattern with democracy and autocracies. So it seems that that kind of may make sense anyway, that in richer places, people are more able to afford these like low-cost monitors for themselves, and they are more even they start caring more about the environment, etc. So they are more likely to buy these like citizen-owned monitors. But as to the impact, I don't really see anything for now. It's actually quite hard to, let's say whether a monitor has a direct impact on air pollution or to do these kind of regressions because the time of placement for each monitor is not always known, or if it is known, it is often very late. So most monitors were set up late in this, so they are set up at the end of, let's say, between 2015 and 2020, which means that it's not so easy to measure um, the impact of placing a monitor down. But so what I want to say here is that there is clearly a potential for monitoring to do something, both citizen-owned and government-owned. Um, but it doesn't need to be there. Clearly, like these places are all improving air pollution levels without having any monitor.
Oh, interesting. Did you ever see a case where monitoring actually led to like an outcome that wasn't expected, or like that it like didn't not that it didn't improve air quality, but it maybe made things worse, not necessarily in terms of air quality, but
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. It's sometimes hard to tell from the empirical data what would one monitor do,
right.
because essentially, let's say you see that a monitor is set up somewhere and then air pollution keeps going up. You don't have a counterfactual, and it could be that because air pollution seems to be such a problem, like let's say the local government could struggle to fix air pollution, and so
Mhm.
they try to increase their air pollution monitoring networks to better understand the problem. So there is also some kind of circularity between the monitor being placed, which could be also because people are struggling to understand where is the pollution coming from, for example. And so there would be a very like a strong delay in what it would do to air pollution levels. But I also want to point to this paper here, where we also argue that there can be some negative effects of having a monitor if no political action is put. So I'll try to be quick with this example, but let's say we think of this example like the US embassy putting down a monitor somewhere. And so now there is air pollution levels, but it might be that the state capacity to deal with the issue is not possible. Like the state is still like developing and there is not enough enforcement capacity for the government to do anything about it. And then people might see that it is very polluted and that the government doesn't do anything. And this can lead to, okay, a feeling of the problem being impossible to solve.
I see. That's super interesting. Yeah, if anyone else wants to ask anything, feel free. Um, I guess another question I have in the meantime is just like, could you tell us more about these partnerships that your group has with like in Jakarta and South Africa, and like how those were formed, and um, yeah, like what was the nature of starting a partnership like that? Um,
Yeah, it's also we're thinking about how do we do these like north-south collaborations in let's say in the most ethical way, in the most like in the way that yeah, both parties feel good, which actually to be very transparent, our experience in South Africa was quite complicated. It was the first time that our group had I mean the group as it is when I started my PhD had this collaboration with this partner in South Africa. And I think yeah, on our side things didn't go perfectly, like things were not handled in the perfect way. Um, so yeah, this so how this was formed is a bit randomly. So let's say there was a common interest to do this fieldwork campaign about air pollution in Johannesburg. Um, and um, a senior scientist in my group had a contact with the scientist in South Africa, and this is how we created this collaboration. And yeah, I found it quite hard to navigate the power imbalances in like, let's say we, in this case, we were funding most of what the fieldwork campaign would be. But obviously, I mean, the local partners would know better about what's happening on the ground, would also like speak the local language, know the local culture, know which questions would be interesting. And I guess now we're having another partnership in Pakistan, which is going much better. And I think it's also because we like applied for the funding together, and this was created together from the ground up. So yeah, I don't know if I have like a good advice on, or if my experience is like representative experience, but I would say it is something that at least I was surprised how maybe hard it is to navigate, even knowing about like these like low health differences and power imbalances, and knowing about helicopter research. Like not doing it is actually you need to put a lot of effort in it. At least that's how it felt for our institution on how to navigate this. So yeah.
Wow, yeah, I think just even being able to compare different experiences is really valuable. And I think we had a workshop on helicopter science. Maybe Simone can talk more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. Rebecca Garland she's a professor in South Africa. She actually did a workshop for us on helicopter science and
Mm,
setting up collaborations between Global South and Global North and like, trying to make that an equitable partnership and how that should look. So if anybody's interested in that, there should be recordings on our website from that workshop with Rebecca. But it is really hard. And that was also what Rebecca said, that it's really hard, especially like the first times. You gotta like, you gotta just communicate and learn from each other along the way. And hopefully that makes it easier the next time. Because it is you do come from different backgrounds and you somehow have to make it so both parts get something out of the collaboration.
yeah. Actually, something that we did now for this upcoming fieldwork in Pakistan is like a MOU, so like a document where we would both state, okay, what are we putting in this? Who is in charge of what, and like making things very clear from the beginning about who gets what and who is in charge of what on so many different dimensions. I don't know if that can be also something to. I don't know if they mentioned it in this presentation.
I don't remember. It's been a couple, I want to say years.
Mhm.
Probably about almost 2 years, 1.5. Um,
Just give it a few minutes in case someone is thinking of a question.
I'll go back to my final slide then. So people can really have it printed like this.
Um, I guess just something else that comes up is like, have you thought about like other theories of change that don't necessarily focus on like citizens asking for action and like what incentives does a government have to do it regardless of what their citizens are asking for? Yeah, have you ever thought of something like that?
Yeah, no, that's also a good question because I did think about kind of, okay, a monitor is placed, what can happen? And I have like, weird diagrams with arrows that go everywhere and like feedbacks. Um, and I guess a way, it's not such a complicated other way, let's say, but I thought it's more the technocratic thinking that I think goes a lot in how we present the need for more monitoring is, oh, we need to understand better the local context. What exactly is the pollution we're looking at? Where is it coming from? Kind of this source apportionment and increasing accountability more from the government side. So let's say the citizens may look at air pollution levels and want to be able to tell if their government is doing something about it, if they are making progress. But what the government might do on the other side is like more the expert way of thinking, okay, who is actually responsible for this? And so there is the citizen side for me that goes from citizens to the government as an accountability arrow, and there is the government trying to find, okay, but who's actually responsible for these sources? So for me, that would be the other way is essentially, yeah, maybe it would be somehow here on the third line already. And how do you design policies that target largest polluters in the most efficient way?
I see. Yeah. It just made me think about like your reflection questions at the start, which I really appreciated. Because I started thinking like, oh, like why do I not believe that like my state can solve like the air quality problems that we experience? And I thought about it in terms of it's mostly transport, like from far away or even from like right, like states that aren't my state, but are also even different countries. So then there's a question of do we even have the like political structure to deal with cross country pollution issues. And so I think your thesis about a lot of these problems being fundamentally political in nature is important for that reason, and that there's a lot of unsolved problems in this field from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this transboundary pollution is a perfect example of how do you get countries to cooperate when a country, in theory, has no incentive to solve air pollution for another country, right? If they can just export their pollution somewhere. So yeah, I very much agree with that.
Well, I think we're done for the day. The recording will be available for anyone who wants to share this. And wait, let me just put it in the chat real quick, the email for anyone who wants to present next time. So it's IGAC ECR at igacproject.org. Does that work? Okay, yeah. And Simone will read those emails so you can address that to Simone. But yeah, thank you so much, Camille, for your super interesting presentation. And yeah, and for your perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.